Okay, good evening.
Good evening.
Yeah, we're only 12 minutes late, but I swear about 75% of the time I try to connect to that printer, it just does not want to print anything. And I have the cable, so I can just bypass the Wi-Fi and plug directly in. And apparently my cable has a short in it, so I have to continuously hold the cable in while I'm also trying to type stuff so I can get it to print. And it's a whole ordeal. But, life happens.
Well, you stand on one leg and scratch your head with the other hand, right?
Yeah.
And hold your mouth right.
Yeah. Life just happens. That's all I can say. So if you'll notice, we're not technically covering the entire chapter. I mean, I've done this a couple times before. This is another weird example of the chapter break and the section break just kind of being at this wonky spot where, you're left with like one or two verses at the end of a chapter that start a new section that goes into the next chapter. I thought, well, it would be weird to start, sort of a new section and then just immediately end it without any of the context of the rest of that section. So, we're only technically covering verses 1 through 11. And then next week we'll pick up with 11, 12, and then do the rest of chapter 12. If you have a Bible with subheadings, you'll see what I'm talking about. But anyway, I thought, for whatever reason, that this would be a great week to do some recap. It is color-coded, and those of us with weaker eyes might have a hard time reading the yellow. But as I said before, that's okay, because I'm sure you all remember exactly what we talked about in Hosea chapter 3, word for word, and all of this is superfluous. We're not going to actually talk about all this. I mean, I mainly did this for your benefit. I guess I can go ahead and say the stuff in yellow, because, that is a little hard to read. But this is Hosea 3, the bullet points there. So Israel is prophesied to be without a king, without sacrifices, and without priests. So, this was in Hosea 3. It was a very short chapter. Same passage talking about Gomer, being bought back. And it says, the children of Israel shall abide many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, without ephod or teraphim. And the second bullet point there in yellow is that this was ultimately fulfilled during the Assyrian exile. And then your third bullet point is afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. And that's just a direct quote from verse 5 of chapter 3. And the yellow, all this, or most of this, is color-coded. And the yellow is judgment before restoration. So you see the judgment of you're not going to have a king, you're not going to have a sacrifice, you're not going to have a priest. And then the restoration is, but one day you're going to return and seek the Lord and seek David your king. The only other instance of yellow is Hosea 5. 3 bullet points there. It says verses 8 through 14 announce judgment against Israel. Right? So go to chapter 8 and you see Israel is swallowed up. They shall sorrow a little because of the burden of their king. For the sacrifices of my offerings, they sacrifice flesh and eat it, but the Lord does not accept them. So you have judgment. But then, and again, this is verse 14. God is commanding the Assyrian army. This is where we get the lion language. So again, this was fulfilled during the Assyrian conquest and exile. And then the last bullet point is, but, verse 15, the lion will return to its place, right? So you have sort of restoration language after judgment. We're not going to really talk about all this, but the main thing is I'm trying to highlight some of the, overarching themes from the book of Hosea. These are far from the only instances of these themes occurring. This is just sort of a general overview of a couple of the times that they do occur, a couple of the times that maybe we really honed in on. But so you have green, which is political instability, right? The quick turnover of kings after Jeroboam II. Also, the quick turnover of, or the quick change in sort of foreign policy and military or political alliances, right? All of this instability. Blue is religious syncretism, right? That's a big one. I mean, we've been talking about that almost every week. You know, something old, something new, something true, something pagan, you know. Yellow, the one that no one can read, is judgment before restoration, right? We just talked about that. That's a theme throughout the minor prophets. A lot of these are themes throughout the minor prophets, not specific to Hosea. And this one will come into play tonight. So, you know, keep that in the back of your mind. Red is, right, the top-down problem, right? Or it also says examples of those in power just being called out, right? You know, Hosea or any of the minor prophets are hardly anti-authority. But, yeah, they don't have a problem calling out authority when there's clearly a misuse of power and when it's clearly the priest or the kings are influencing the common people into idolatry or just general wickedness. Orange is a disregard for the manner of proper worship. So, you know, oh, well, we don't need to go to Jerusalem. We'll make our own Jerusalem. You know, we'll make our own altars, our own shrines, right? And, you know, even if, which they weren't, but even if, you know, it was exactly like it was in Jerusalem and there was no, you know, syncretizing paganism or no idolatry at all, it would still be wrong, right? Because there is a method and a manner to the worship of God, which includes location. Or another thing is a disregard for the interior aspect of worship. So, you know, again, we see this a lot in the minor prophets, but, you know, the whole, you know, you worship me with your mouths, but your hearts are far from me aspect, right? You know, all these sort of external markings that would, you know, make me stand out from the world as an Israelite. I do all those. Any of the sort of interior keeping of the covenant, right? I have no interest in that at all, is basically the idea. And then finally, purple is a reversal of what was once a good thing, right? So the Exodus from Egypt, I think everyone would argue, that was a good thing. Well, now it's, congratulations, you're going to go back to Egypt, right? And it's a reversal of that. Or, you know, the Festival of Tabernacles, you'll notice, Hosea 9, a good thing, right? Everyone loves some time off work. Everyone loves camping, right? You know, go tent camping. Maybe in younger days you did that. Maybe you do that now. I don't know. But, right, when there's no festivals and there's no sacrifices, right, that means exile. That means, right, you know, obviously something is going wrong with, you know, you and your country and your people when you're not in a position to have those feasts and sacrifices. And so what was once good, right, there's a reversal of that. So anyway, that's sort of your recap. I kind of did that to recap, but mainly to sort of draw out these themes that you can trace in the book of Hosea. And once again, even if you can't read necessarily all of this, the main idea is, okay, well, look at the colors, look at the bottom, what those colors represent, and you can see how, oh, even all the way back in Hosea chapter 3, we were dealing with blue. Well, what is blue? Oh, it's religious syncretism. And we see that in 4, we see that in 7, we see that in 8, we see that in 10, and really we could even see that in 6, 8, 9. I just didn't necessarily highlight those for you. So the purpose is to see how through the book of Hosea we see these themes developing through multiple chapters. So anyway, that brings us to chapter 11. And once again, we're only going to be reading the first 11 verses of that. So Wait till the pages stop flipping. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 11. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. And as they called them, so they went from them. They sacrificed to the Baals and burned incense to carved images. I taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by their arms, but they did not know that I had healed them. I drew them with gentle cords, with bands of love, and I was to them as those who take the yoke from their neck. I stooped and fed them. He shall not return to the land of Egypt, but the Assyrian shall be his king, because they refuse to repent. The sword shall slash in his cities, devour his districts, and consume them, because of their own counsels. My people are bent on backsliding from me. Though they call to the Most High, none at all exalt him. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I set you like Zeboim? My heart churns within me. My sympathy is stirred. I will not execute the fierceness of my anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim. For I am God and not man. The Holy One is in your midst, and I will not come with terror. They shall walk after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, then his son shall come trembling from the west. They shall come trembling like a bird from Egypt, like a dove from the land of Assyria, and I will let them dwell in their houses, says the Lord. So, okay, we talked about the main themes throughout the book of Hosea, and now we get to see which of those themes, or at least which ones that I wanted to talk about anyway, we see in chapter 11. This is like so self-explanatory that you probably don't even need me to go over this, but I will. Verse 5 of chapter 11. We see, he shall not return to the land of Egypt, but the Assyrian shall be his king because they refuse to repent. Well, right, we've seen, not exactly, depending on your translation, not exactly this before, but we've seen wording similar to it. Hosea chapter 8, verse 13, they shall return to Egypt, right? Also, the Assyrian shall be his king because they refuse to repent, from verse 5 of chapter 11. Well, chapter 10, verse 3, Hosea is prophesying, for now they say, we have no king because we do not fear the Lord. Well, yeah, they have no king that's an Israelite. Hosea says the Assyrian's going to be their king, right? So we see that theme picked up as well. And then, right, your little fill in the blank, this is an example of a reversal of the Exodus. So that would be, your little yellow. Let me get there. Sorry, not yellow. Purple. I don't know. Yeah, this is an example of purple. Reversal of what was once good, right? Tracking that theme throughout the book of Hosea. Next up, we have verse 7. Verse 7 of Hosea 11. My people are bent on backsliding from me. Though they call to the Most High, none at all exalt him. Well, we've seen similar to this in Hosea 6:6. For I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. So this is an example of, your fill in the blank, a complete disregard for the interior aspect of proper worship. And this is in our theming color system, orange, right? Orange is disregard for the manner of proper worship and also disregard for the interior aspect of proper worship, right? Well, I can be, biggest sinner I want to, but, hey, I go to my, altar or my little, shrine, and I do some, kind of sort of pagan, kind of sort of, true worship. And, it all evens out in the end, right? Hosea says no, right? It doesn't even out in the end. There's a complete disregard for the interior aspect of proper worship. And finally, we have verse 10 of chapter 11. They shall walk after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, then his son shall come trembling from the west. So, verse 10, he will roar like a lion. Well, we've seen this, In Hosea chapter 5, right, verses 13 and 14, they were the judgment. Then verse 15, there was the restoration. The lion will return to his place. But Hosea 5:14, it says, I will be like a lion to Ephraim and like a young lion to the house of Judah. So you're filling the blank. I already kind of gave it away. This is an example of judgment before restoration. So tracking this in the context of Hosea as a whole, I think is pretty important because, I mean, these are clearly repeated themes and for good reason, right? So now let's kind of get into more of our traditional, I guess, study and how that looks like. So verse 1, you have a fill-in-the-blank thing. Actually, well, you were supposed to have a fill-in-the-blank thing, and then you were supposed to have a chart. But I didn't turn the blue into a blank. So your first fill-in-the-blank that's not even a blank on your thing is Exodus 4. So there you go. Clearly, we have Exodus language in verse 1. However, there is a pretty clear parallel with Exodus 4. That was supposed to be a blank, my bad. So now, right, we have this chart, okay? On the left, first blank is also Exodus 4. So you do get to write it. And then on the right, as you can probably guess, is Hosea 11. And we're sort of comparing the two there. Specifically, Exodus 4:22 and Hosea 11:1. So your second blank on the left side, verse 22, Israel is my firstborn son, right? And this is all in the context of, right, God telling Moses what to say to Pharaoh. And then you see this because your third blank on the left, verse 22, let my son go, right? So Moses is supposed to go to Pharaoh and say, hey, Israel is God's firstborn son. And because of that, God says, let my son go. Let my people go. Right. So on the right-hand side, once again, Hosea 11 at the top, out of Egypt I called my son. Right. You don't even need me to say that. I mean, it should be right in front of you. And then third blank, out of Egypt I called my son. So you see here the parallel of Israel is my firstborn son. Out of Egypt I called my son. Let my son go. Out of Egypt I called my son, right? Or going from Egypt I called my son, right? If you want to make a, one-to-one parallel with the wording there, I guess. We can't really talk about Hosea 11:1 without bringing up Matthew 2:13 through 15. So, wow. The train. So Matthew 2:13 through 15. It says, when they had gone, that is, when the wise men had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed there until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. So, yeah, if you were, reading this, for the first time in a while, and you kind of forgot that that's where that camp comes from in Matthew, you might have done a double take. You might have been a little surprised. And if you're anything like me, when, you read this for the first time, you're like, verse 1 of chapter 11 of Hosea has absolutely nothing to do with Jesus in context. And you'd be absolutely correct, right? I mean, this is not, in context, a messianic passage. I mean, this is just talking about Israel, the people. When Israel was a child, I loved him. Out of Egypt, I called my son. And they called them, right? Or, I didn't mark it down, but I think it's footnoted. Just as I called, just as I called them, another translation. So they went from them, they sacrificed to the Baals and burned incense to carved images. Well, obviously, I mean, that's not talking about Jesus because Jesus didn't burn incense to false gods or whatever. It's clearly just talking about the children of Israel, the Israelites, and the literal exodus from, with Moses and all of that, exodus from Egypt, right? So why is Matthew bringing that up, and why does he say that it's a fulfillment, right? Hosea himself is hardly concerned with context, not just in 11, but I mean, he himself refers to things that for him happened previously and were written down previously and sort of applies them to what's going on in Israel at his time, right? I mean, you have the reference to Baal Peor, the reference to Gibeah, the reference to Shechem, right? All of these things, right? Okay, y'all messed up real bad in Gibeah when you almost wiped out an entire tribe, or y'all messed up real bad in Shechem when, y'all wanted to get revenge and you went in and slaughtered all these people, or y'all messed up real bad at Baal Peor, with all the idol worship. And so, right, I mean, obviously, when Hosea is referencing all of this, it's not meant to be read in a strictly literal sense that Israel's doing the exact same thing in the exact same way at the exact same place as they had previously, right? I mean, Hosea is not calling out, just the town of Shechem and saying, y'all are doing the same stuff that you were doing in the exact same way, 1,000 years ago or whatever, right? I mean, obviously, his point is that as before, before Israel sinned and was punished, or before Israel sinned and, there were consequences that came about from that, such as almost, genociding one of, the 12 tribes. As before all that happened, so too now in Hosea's time, Israel is sinning and will reap the consequences of that. God will judge them, or, they will be wiped out, right? And so it's kind of a similar case when the gospel writers apply, especially Matthew, he's the one that really gets a lot of people because he just kind of, he's the worst, person at just sort of taking something from the Old Testament and saying, okay, well, this is a typology of Christ, so we're just going to say, oh, this is a fulfillment of it. And people are like, wait a minute, how is this a fulfillment of it? If in context that has nothing to do with the Messiah. But it's the same case as what Hosea was doing. I mean, the gospel writers, especially Matthew, they were applying a lot of these Old Testament prophecies, or really just passages, to Jesus, right? Following that same model of interpretation that was already used in the Old Testament. So it's not like they just sort of invented this. In the case of this, Matthew chapter 2 versus Hosea chapter 11, just as the Father loved Israel, whom he calls his son, and delivered his son from exile in Egypt through Moses, so also Matthew argues, does God the Father love Jesus, who is the eternally begotten Son of God, and delivered him from, albeit a much shorter exile in Egypt, through the death of Herod. So, I mean, right, all of that, I mean, kind of makes sense. And, I mean, a lot of y'all been in church longer than I've been alive. So, you probably don't get tripped up on this as much as, new believers or people who approach the Bible with a lot of skepticism. But it is important to bring up because, I mean, these are the kind of things that people will point to as, why the Bible doesn't make any sense or isn't reliable is because, right, in their words, they're not treating the individual parts of the Bible on their own terms. But I mean, as I argued, that method of interpretation of typology is certainly not new to Matthew or the New Testament either. Admittedly, in terms of, okay, right, well, we get that, but why did Matthew call this a fulfillment? Why didn't he just say this was a typology or something like that? One scholar does say the word for called them in Hosea 11:1, out of Egypt I called my son. That word called admittedly has its own meaning in Hosea in a context which does not concern itself with the Messiah. I've already said that. I've already said as much. He also admits that the word has a fuller meaning derived from the double potential of this specific wording that is chosen. So, in addition to this word being used by Hosea, right, called my son, in addition to just meaning to choose, right, think back to Hosea chapter 9, verse 10. I found Israel. Well, that's sort of election language, right? I chose Israel, which we took that passage and traced it all the way back to Deuteronomy, where God says he chose Jacob or he found Jacob, right? So in addition to just meaning choosing or election, right, it can also mean to summon, right? We use the word in that sense in English, call the kids to supper, right? But we don't necessarily mean choose the kids to supper. We mean, right, get them out of their rooms and get them to the supper table, right? Right, in terms of the Mosaic exodus from Egypt, right, Israel was both summoned by God to depart from Egypt and also was chosen or adopted by God to be his children through the Exodus narrative, or at the very least, the adoption was sort of renewed and strengthened. When does the covenant begin? Well, really, you trace it back to Abraham, but then you also kind of trace it back to Moses. But then, which part? Do you trace it back to, the burning bush, or do you push it back a little bit farther after the Exodus? But even then, there's also sort of this renewing of the covenant with, entering the promised land. So, they were, the children of Israel, and God had already promised to bless them. But as that blessing became a reality, and especially as, the exodus from exile became a reality, you see the adoption language used almost as if it was the first time, right? Sort of a renewal of that adoption or that covenant. But I'm getting a little sidetracked with myself. So all this is to say, the gospel writers recognized, okay, Jesus was summoned out of Egypt, right? In that sense of the word called, right? Jesus was hardly adopted as the Son of God, after Herod died, as if to imply that he wasn't the Son of God in Bethlehem, or, that he wasn't the Son of God for all of eternity, right? That is a heresy, by the way. And if you or anyone believes that, we have dealt with that 1,700 years ago. So, pretty much every Christian denomination on the planet can at least agree on that much. So you or your friend is a very fringe group of Christian if you believe Jesus was adopted as the Son of God. But again, I'm getting off track. Right, Jesus was summoned, right, out of Egypt. Or, more specifically, I guess Joseph was sort of summoned, and then he took Jesus out of Egypt. Because, and this is your blank, I believe, because the word call, blank one, can have multiple meanings, even within the same verse, that verse being Hosea 11, verse 1, it has been argued by scholars that Jesus can be the fulfillment of the fuller meaning of the verse, even though in context, Hosea 11:1 is not messianic. So I'll go over that again because, that's like three blanks in one. So the first one, the word call can have multiple meanings. Okay, blank one is call. It has been argued that Jesus can be the fulfillment of the fuller meaning Blank 2, even though in context Hosea 11:1 is not messianic. Blank 3. And if you'll remember all the way back, like week 1, for all of the like intro stuff, and especially like the was Gomer a prostitute, was she not kind of thing, I took 2 commentaries and I sort of pitted them against each other, right? So one of those commentators, that's sort of where this line of thinking that I'm using is coming from, although it's hardly original to him. I mean, this has been pretty much, how people have sort of understood Matthew's usage of the Old Testament forever. But that's sort of what Commentary 1 says. Commentary 2, they will argue that that alone, right, that sort of typology alone doesn't necessarily answer whether Matthew is using Hosea correctly or not. And that's true, right? I mean, we get the typology thing and we get the as before, so too now thing, but Matthew does sort of call it a fulfillment, which makes us wonder, okay, even if like the typology aspect is correct, is Hosea just straight up misconstruing, or sorry, is Matthew just straight up misconstruing Hosea to fit a typology, even if the typology is there? The answer is no, and we're going to talk about that at the very end. But this is a quote from the commentary that sort of argues in favor of the typology thing I've been talking about. He says, a person can always appeal to the fuller meaning, the principle that says the Old Testament writers sometimes wrote better than they knew, because the Holy Spirit led them to use vocabulary that had a significance of which the writers themselves were unaware. So yeah, basically, again, the word can have multiple meanings. For Jesus, it had a very specific meaning, different from necessarily what it meant in the context of the Mosaic Exodus. And because of that, it's not a misuse to call Jesus a fulfillment, because the Holy Spirit, led the writer to use this vocabulary in a very specific way. But then again, is he misusing Hosea? Is Matthew misusing Hosea? Is he not? Well, yeah, we're going to have to get to that, because you really have to take the entire chapter of Hosea and look at that as a whole before you can really answer that question. So verse 5, very short. Yeah, there's only, one little blank there. I only have one little paragraph. Verse 5 does kind of seem, in the New King James, to contradict chapter 8, verse 13. And if you go back up on your handout, 8:13 is given to you on the same page. So, right, he shall not return to the land of Egypt. Well, Hosea 8:3 says they shall return to Egypt, right? So what is he? Is he contradicting himself? Did he, get hit in the head and forget what he had said earlier? Right. Well, the NIV will actually translate this as, will they not return to Egypt? So in the form of a question. An independent translation just straight up says, he will return to the land of Egypt. And, there's a lot of grammar that can go into this that we're not really concerned with. But, even if the New King James is correct and it straight up just on a grammatical level contradicts chapter 8, and it says, he shall not return to the land of Egypt, that's not really a contradiction, because, and this is your fill in the blank, there's the clarification in the second part of that verse. The clarification of who will be over Israel, right? Which is the Assyrians. And where they will be captives, which is Assyria, right? So before, Egypt is another example of this typology, right? Because all the times that Hosea is talking about Egypt, you're like, Israel didn't go to Egypt, they went to Assyria. Is Hosea just misusing, these, curses from Deuteronomy talking about the return to Egypt? Well, no, but he's saying, as you were enslaved in Egypt, but then I brought you out of Egypt, you're going to return to being enslaved, to being in exile, essentially. But there's the clarification that, right, he shall not return to the land of Egypt, clarifying, but the Assyrian shall be his king, because they refuse to repent, and the sword shall slash in his cities, right? So your blanks are who, and then over, where, and captives. So there's the clarification over who will be over them and where they will be captives, which is Assyria. So moving on to verse 8. This is really where we sort of get into that restoration language, right? Once again, judgment before restoration, a theme we find a lot. And we see, we've seen a lot of this before. I mean, Israel being called Ephraim, God being called a lion, Egypt being used in place of Assyria. I mean, it's all sort of language we've seen before. But there is something in verse 8 that is original to this chapter. Two places that most likely unless you have a study Bible or something, or if it's footnoted, I don't know why it would be footnoted, but if it is, apart from a study note, then you probably aren't going to get the reference, right? I didn't get the reference without, looking into this myself. But Admah and Zeboim, right? That's what's new, We got the lion language before. We've got, Ephraim. Okay, we've got that before. But Admah and Zeboim, that's new. Where are these places? Why are they significant? Why are we being called back to them? Well, first, let me kind of give you a little hint. Admah might hold extra significance. Zeboim has significance. Admah might have a little bit more. I'll let you wonder what that is for a moment. But first, right, let's just get with the sort of baseline significance that both Admah and Zeboim have together. So they're both mentioned in Deuteronomy 29, verses 22 to 24. All right. This is not the narrative account of Sodom and Gomorrah, but this is sort of recalling Sodom and Gomorrah. Lumped in with Sodom and Gomorrah are Admah and Zeboim. So I'll read this real quick. 3 verses, 22 to 24. Your children who follow you in later generations and foreigners who come from distant lands will see the calamities that have fallen on the land and the diseases with which the Lord has afflicted it. The whole land will be a burning waste of salt and sulfur. Nothing planted, nothing sprouted, no vegetation growing on it. It will be like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim. All right? So, we say normally Sodom and Gomorrah. We lump them together. Good. Cool. But there were other places around there that were also destroyed in the process. 2 of which being Admah and Zeboim. Sorry, let me finish that verse real quick. It will be like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in fierce anger. All the nations will ask, why has the Lord done this to the land? Why this fierce burning anger? So that's the end of that verse from Deuteronomy. But Admah and Zeboim, like we said, they're destroyed in addition to Sodom and Gomorrah. So that's sort of significant in and of itself. As to why Admah might have extra significance on top of that, well, I say might because it's all hinging upon a scholarly theory, which, as from me bringing up a lot of these theories, they don't necessarily mean anything. But I think that this is very cool. I think that this is interesting. So some scholars argue that Admah is the ancient city of Adam. Okay. Now, we've talked about an ancient city of Adam in Hosea before, in Hosea chapter 6, right? Hosea sort of references 3 places where Israel really messed up. All right? You have the reference to Shechem, you have the reference to Gilead, and you have the reference to Adam. However, it's likely just translated as man in whatever version you're using. Verse 7 of chapter 6, but like men, they transgressed the covenant. Well, Adam is just man. It's just a transliterated version of man or men. People argue Admah is the ancient city of Adam. And when we were in chapter 6, right, we talked about, okay, Shechem is a city, and Israel did bad things there. Gilead is a city, and Jacob kind of did bad things there, so we think that might be what was at play. And then we got to Adam, and we were like, okay, well, clearly he's making a comparison between Adam the person, because Adam was the first sinner against God, so there's significance in that. But also, Adam was a town. And while we don't necessarily have any record in the Bible of Israel doing anything bad at Adam, I quoted from someone who says, well, hold on. I thought that I had written this down, but basically says, wait, here it is. Inasmuch as there were shrines throughout Israel at the time of Hosea, we don't need to be surprised that the town of Adam would have also had a shrine, right? So you have the significance in chapter 6 of, okay, Shechem, biblically we have record of really bad things happening there. Gilead, right, biblically bad stuff happened there. Adam, is it just a reference to Adam the man as the first transgressor of God's covenant? Or is it also, in addition to that, a reference to the actual town and the wickedness and the idolatry that might have been going on there? And so I think that it is. So putting all this together in a blank that really can sum this up, there was a town called Adam. This is a historical fact. We don't know where that town is located, but it did exist. Even if the primary emphasis in chapter 6 was on Adam, the man, and if, as the scholars suggested, there was in fact pagan shrines or altars in the city of Adam, and if Adam is the same as Admah, then in addition to simply being a restatement or a fulfillment of Deuteronomy 29, Hosea is pointing out real locations of rampant idolatry and syncretism that have in the past been severely punished by God. So, yeah, you have... Yeah, I will. One second. So you have Admah and Zeboim, both of which, from the Bible, were destroyed alongside Sodom and Gomorrah. So, as in the past, right, these cities were severely punished. God says in verse 8, how can I make you like Admah? How can I make you like Zeboim, right? In the past, these cities were destroyed completely. I'm not going to do that to you, God says. But with Admah specifically, again, all hinging upon the fact that Admah is the same as Adam, right? As even in Hosea's day, potentially, there was massive idolatry and paganism and syncretism going on in the city of Adam, right? Hosea name drops Adam or Admah and says, hey, I destroyed it once for their, idolatry, or just more specific, their rebellion against me. And they're still, even today, idolatrous and pagan and rebelling against me. But I will not destroy you, Ephraim, Israel, like I destroyed Admah or Adam way back when with Sodom and Gomorrah, even though it's still wicked. And y'all, Israel, Ephraim, are still wicked, right? So there's sort of a double significance there. As far as the blank goes, there was a town, blank one, called Adam, even if the primary emphasis in chapter 6 was on Adam, the man, right, from the Garden of Eden. And if, as the scholar suggested, there were, in fact, pagan shrines or altars in the city of Adam, and if Adam is the same as Admah, then in addition to simply being a restatement or fulfillment of Deuteronomy 29, once again, that's where we have Admah and Zeboim name dropped as also being destroyed with Sodom and Gomorrah. So in addition to simply restating that, Hosea is pointing out real locations in his time and day of rampant idolatry and syncretism that have already in the past been, your last blank, severely punished by God. So, as back then, so too very soon, right? No, God will not utterly destroy Ephraim and Israel as he did Admah and Zeboim, or Sodom and Gomorrah for that matter, right? In addition to God's love and preservation for his people, right? Because you read this at a face value and you get, oh, God's preserving the covenant. God's preserving his people, right? How can I give you up? How can I hand you over? How can I make you like Admah? How can I make you like Zeboim? So in addition to the love and the preservation, there could also be a warning here, right? Because in addition to that, God could basically be saying, I destroyed Admah once for their sin. Why are you going back to Admah? Why are you going back to Adam to sin even more? Right? Why are you still setting up shrines here? Why are you still setting up altars and doing the same thing? Don't you remember what happened to these people way back when? Right? So there could be a warning in addition to simply, oh, I love you and I'm not going to, I'm not going to completely cut you off. There's that, obviously, but there's also maybe a hint of a warning here as well. Finally, verse 10. We see the lion language again in verse 10 of chapter 11. I've talked before about the differences between the large-scale restoration of Judah and the small-scale, more spiritual restoration of the northern kingdom. If you remember Judah, they could return. They could and did rebuild. The northern kingdom, they did not, right? But there are still promises, even promises of physical restoration, given by the minor prophets to the northern kingdom. Just keep in mind that difference between sort of a large-scale restoration and more of a small-scale spiritual restoration given to the remnant. And even in Hosea, you go back to chapter 1, God himself says, right, in the whole living sermon illustration thing with, Hosea's 3 kids, Lo, Ruhama, I will not have mercy. God says, I will no longer have mercy on the house of Israel. Then it goes on a little bit. Yet I will have mercy on the house of Judah. And we talked about, there is this historical reality that Judah continued, right? Israel, the northern kingdom, large scale did not. But think about the Messianic age, right? There is, promises to those in exile in Assyria, even though they're not going to rebuild the northern kingdom. They're not going to be, free, independent people, whatever, there is that, but think to the Messianic age, into the church age, because we have the benefit of perspective, right? I mean, we can look in the same way that, I mean, Hosea looked backwards in time through, to the Exodus and to all these different towns and incidents of Israel sinning. We have the perspective of time of being in 2024, so we can look backwards where even Jesus and the apostles are, historical to us, right? Jesus' time on earth is in the past for us, right? So think to the Messianic age, think about the church age. When we went over Hosea 1:10 through 2:1, so 1:10 and 11 and then 2:1, I talked about how all of that was sort of ultimately fulfilled in the Messianic age, even though the language could intentionally on the part of Hosea, because I mean, obviously Hosea didn't have a full understanding of the Messiah or Jesus or any of that. So intentionally, the language can be read as exilic or post-exilic even, I guess. Right? Even though, I mean, that's the case, it was ultimately fulfilled in the Messianic age. And we know this because we can look back through history in a way that Hosea and those listening to Hosea in the 8th century could not. Right? And that's the same case in chapter 11 as well. So there's the word that in the New King James and probably, I think the NIV and most translations, they're going to translate as west. In verse 10, then his son shall come trembling from the west. That can also mean waters. The Septuagint translates it that way. That's also just looking strictly at the Hebrew. That could also be what that means. So, right, you have coming from the west, coming from the waters. The point then is that the people, right, I mean, they're not going to be coming from Israel. They're going to be coming from not Israel. They're going to be coming from the waters. They're going to be coming from the west, right? And, if in 8th century, I think this is the start of your blank, if an 8th century BC Israelite heard these words recited while he's living in exile, right? So imagine you're, in Assyria or wherever you're relocated to, and you're in the 8th century, and there's a guy who has a copy of Hosea's words or maybe just remembers really well what Hosea said. And he comes to you and he says, they shall walk after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, then his son shall come trembling from the west. They shall come trembling like a bird from Egypt, like a dove from the land of Assyria. And I will let them dwell in their houses, says the Lord. So if you're hearing that in the 8th century and you're in exile, you're not going to be thinking of Jesus because you have no concept of who Jesus is, right? And you're not going to be interpreting that in a messianic sense. You're going to be thinking, this dude Hosea is telling me I'm going to be coming up out of Assyria. We're going to be freed, right? Just like we were from Egypt, right? And that's intentional, right? So getting back to your blank, if an 8th century BC Israelite heard these words recited while living in exile, he would interpret them to mean the end of exile, right? He'd interpret them to mean the end of exile. However, once again, we have the benefit of looking back through history, and we can see that fuller meaning or fuller fulfillment. I don't know that that's grammatically correct to say fuller fulfillment, but I'm using it anyway, right? The final fulfillment, I guess, would be how you might maybe want to phrase that. In the Messianic age and the church age, those who were once outside of the covenant or not God's people will become the children of God. And this is what we see in chapter 1, verse 10, right? That is your blank, by the way, chapter 1, verse 10. Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And it shall come to pass, in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there it shall be said to them, you are sons of the living God. right? And like we talked about back then, I mean, that was finally fulfilled in the Messianic age. So, those who were once outside of the covenant, those who were once not God's people, will become the children of God, chapter 1, verse 10. And there will be mercy shown, chapter 2, verse 1. These people will come not only from Israel, but from the seas, or from the west, chapter 11, verse 10. And from the ends of the earth, Acts chapter 1, verse 8, tying it all into the Messianic age. So, yeah, that was a lot of blanks. So do I need to repeat anything?
You need to have us a cheat sheet. Yeah, go ahead and go over it one more time.
Okay, so if an 8th century BC Israelite heard these words recited while living in exile, he would interpret them to mean the end of exile. Right? I'm not thinking Jesus. I'm thinking I'm going to be, my prison bars are going to fly off and I'm walking out of Egypt. However, we have the benefit of looking back through history. We can see that fuller meaning or final fulfillment of Hosea. In the Messianic age and the church age, those who were once outside of the covenant or not God's people will become the children of God, chapter 1, verse 10, and there will be mercy shown, chapter 2, verse 1. These people will come not only from Israel, but from the seas or from the west, chapter 11, verse 10, and from the ends of the earth, Acts chapter 1, verse 8. This is a quote, and I think it's really good, and I think it basically puts this all together. It says, the joint return of Israel's remnant began, in a literal sense, during the Persian regime and under King Cyrus in 539 BC. So, in a literal sense, Israel's return, not the northern kingdom, obviously this would be the southern kingdom, but still children of Israel's return, happened when Judah was allowed to return and rebuild, right? That literal face value fulfillment. But he goes on and he says, in the broader sense, Israel's real restoration began only in Christ, the author and finisher of the new covenant. So in chapter 11, verse 11, the New Testament evangelist Matthew is inspired to recognize a foreshadowing of the return of God's son Jesus in his early youth from Egypt. So basically, Hosea 11:1 opens with a verse that's quoted by Matthew, and we wonder how Matthew could do that. If you remember, I brought up the whole typology thing. I said, people still say, even if you're applying the typology, interpretation to Matthew, that doesn't answer the question of why Matthew calls it a fulfillment. True enough, fair enough, right? But I said we'll get to that at the very end. Well, this is the very end, so here we go. Hosea 11:1 opens with the verse quoted by Matthew. How can Matthew do that? Right? Israel was only fully restored, and we see, the restoration that we're talking about is verses 10 and 11. So, verse 1, talks about, Exodus from Egypt. Verses 10 and 11 talk about restoration. Well, Israel was only fully restored when Jesus came onto the scene, right? So in order to make sense of how Matthew calls Jesus the fulfillment of Hosea 11:1, you have to read all of Hosea 11, because you have to get down to 10 and 11 where, okay, in a very face value sense, the children of Israel returned from exile, right? But when you take into account, from the west, from the seas, right, they shall come and tremble, right, before God. That happened in the Messianic age, in the church age, right? Especially, after the gospel left Jerusalem, left Israel, and went out into the world, right? Today you have people from all over the world worshiping, right? The only way you can really make sense of Matthew's use of Hosea 11:1 is to read all of Hosea chapter 11. Unfortunately, we do know that much of ethnic Israel did not receive Jesus, but like I said, people from all over the world did. Paul would say, they've been grafted on, so they're just as much Israel as somebody of Jewish ethnicity, even more so than someone of Jewish ethnicity who rejects Jesus as the Messiah, right? Paul talks about, them being cut off, right? In order for the Gentiles to be grafted on. So, final fulfillment of all this, we only really get in the Messianic age and in the church age. So anyway, any questions or any blanks that were missed? I think the easier thing to do would just be to pass this out. If you miss something, you can just look at this. Well, if I gave you the cheat sheet straight away, then you would, why would you need to listen to me? I already give you all the answers, right?
We'll just check to see if you get it right.
Yeah. Check to make sure that what I'm saying and what I write down are the same, which they're not. So there you go.
That way we can check you.